Welcome, visitors and classmates. This is a documentary by Fernando Ruiz Olivares and Grayson Schultz exploring the Stamp Act of 1765 and its role in sparking the American Revolution.
In the American colonies in 1765, Britain passed the Stamp Act, which taxed stamps, newspapers, playing cards, and other legal documents to help pay for war costs during the War of 7 Years. The Stamp Act was very important because it sparked a reaction from the American colonists, causing them to be violent against British tax collectors, protest for the independence of our country, eventually leading to the Revolutionary War, leading to freedom from Britain, in the end, reforming and making the country of the United States of America. The Stamp Act started in 1765 when Britain needed to pay debts they owed. They didn't have the money, so they taxed the colonies. When Britain left the War of 7 Years, the country was doing very bad. They were in extreme debt because of war costs and more. They were in more than £120 million in debt. Plus, they had recently purchased an extremely large amount of land. They purchased all of the territory from the bottom up to the Mississippi River. The territory was a big win, but it was also a massive expense. Since the land was so big, someone needed to pay for it. So, they taxed the American colonies to make money to afford it. They also had to pay for the soldiers stationed in the colonies. The British ministry didn't have the money then. It was the Chancellor, Sir George Grenville, who had the idea with the help of his treasury, Thomas Whately. Grenville was under immense pressure to find money. He believed that the colonists owed the British money. The big idea was to raise funds for the British Empire to help pay for the French Indian War or the War of 7 Years. The cost to put 10,000 British troops in North America was roughly £300,000 annually. However, the troops weren't just there to protect the colonists, they were there to manage the land that they had recently purchased. They were also there to enforce the Proclamation of 1763, which was a boundary line between the Appalachian Mountains that prohibited the colonists from settling close to Native American tribes.
The British Chancellor, Sir George Grenville, wanted to make the money that came from the combined taxes of the Stamp Act and Sugar Act a common revenue device for England. That can give you an idea about how much money they were planning on making. The British had already passed an act that heavily taxed things like sugar. In 1764, a year before the actual act was passed, the British ministry had planned to pass a stamp tax that would go into effect on November 1st, 1765, to make the colonists pay for part of the cost of stationing British troops in American colonies and war costs. The act made the colonists pay a tax shown by a stamp. Violations of the Stamp Act would be tried in court. In a newspaper article by William Bradford on October 31st, 1765, he stated, "I am sorry to be obliged to acquaint my readers that the Stamp Act is feared to be obligatory upon us after the 1st of November, meaning that he would not be able to write as much because the newspapers would now be taxed." On March 22nd of the year 1765, the British Parliament passed the Stamp Act on New Hampshire, Massachusetts, Rhode Island, Connecticut, New York, New Jersey, Pennsylvania, Delaware, Maryland, Virginia, North Carolina, South Carolina, and Georgia, known as the 13 Colonies, to help pay for the war costs and troops stationed there. However, the Stamp Act did not go into effect until the 1st of November of that same year. They decided to tax nearly every piece of paper used in daily life. They taxed newspapers, pamphlets, almanacs, and if you decided you wanted to play a game, cards and dice were taxed. If you wanted to get married, you had to pay for the stamp on your marriage license. If you were perhaps a lawyer, every single contract would need that stamp. More things like deeds and contracts were also taxed. This stamp was the first time Britain had ever taxed the colonies directly. To get the items you wanted, you had to pay a stamp collector. The colonists didn't like the new stamp, and it showed. This unfortunate event for the colonists happened because the British ministry didn't have enough money to pay for the war debts during the French Indian War. In the years during which the Stamp Act was passed, the French colonists contributed £60,000 each year, which was 17% of the total cost to pay for the British troops in America. Where an act was created on the very last session of Parliament, a lot of responsibilities were given, continued, and paid towards paying the expenses of defending, protecting, and keeping safe the British colonies in land of America, where it is necessary that providing is made for raising more revenues within the King's property in America. The colonists' lives were severely affected by the Stamp Act because some of their parts in their daily life needed to be paid.
The first tax on the colonies was not taken well at all. There were colonial protests against the Stamp Act in 1776. Some locals of eastern North Carolina and plenty of leaders signed a pledge. They said not to pay the tax. Their pledge was printed in the Wilmington newspaper on February 26, 1766. It was called the North Carolina Gazette. Colonists also rejected the act in Virginia. Patrick Henry showed up to the House of Burgesses with a list of 7 resolves that said taxes could not be pressed on colonists except people chosen to represent them. Patrick Henry famously said, "Give me liberty or give me death." The colonists didn't just hate the cost, they hated the principle. They believed that as British subjects, they could only be taxed by their own elected representatives. Since they had no one speaking for them in the London Parliament, they used the famous slogan, "No taxation without representation." Protests like boycotts took place. A very large amount of people generally stopped buying the items that were being taxed. When the tax collectors would get the taxes from the colonists, they would become violent against them, sometimes even vandalizing their homes. The colonists didn't like being taxed because Britain wasn't being taxed, only the colonists were. The colonists did not have any say in this.
In Boston, groups like the Sons of Liberty formed, led by figures like Samuel Adams, who later became one of the founding fathers of the United States. The Sons of Liberty were a secret political organization in the American colonies, formed around 1765 to protest British taxation and policies. They used intimidation and direct action, like the Boston Tea Party, to resist acts like the Stamp Act and Tea Act, fighting for and pushing the colonies toward revolution. Their members included important figures like Samuel Adams and Paul Revere. They used both peaceful boycotts and violent tactics to organize resistance. The Stamp Act was repealed on the 18th of March in 1776. In conclusion, the British ministry was trying to pay for the French Indian War. When they didn't have the money, they turned to the North American colonies and taxed them. The main point of the story was the Stamp Act, why it happened, and the major points that were important to tell. This topic is important because it was a very crucial time in history when Britain had power over the colonies. The American colonists didn't give up, and when they saw the opportunity for freedom, they instantly took it. Thank you for watching our documentary.